Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Hit the notification bell. Don't forget to check out my locals and support me there. For those who are already supporting, thank you for your support. For continued support is necessary to keep this content in production. So, this is episode 40 of the History of Warfare. It's kind of hard to believe right now. We've been at this for 40 episodes already. But, you go ahead.
Oh yeah, you're absolutely right. It's kind of bizarre to think it's gone this far, but yeah, we're 40 episodes in, but we're still only at the we're still well within antiquity, so it's sort of mind-boggling to think how far we have to go.
Exactly. So now we're here at the beginning of the First Macedonian War. Now, as a bit of a preface, so covering the Cleomenian War and the Social War, and now finally the First Macedonian War, the Second and Third Macedonian Wars, which are more famous, especially the second, because that includes the Battle of Cynocephalae. Philip V sort of comes off as a bit of an incompetent because the Romans just steamroll him. But if you look at all of his conflicts up to around 200 BC, where the Second Macedonian War takes place, Philip is actually doing quite well. And we'll see in the First Macedonian War that Philip does a lot better, in part because Rome is distracted than you would otherwise think from just looking at the Second Macedonian War. So we begin where we left off last time. Philip ended the Social War in order to begin the process of attacking Rome. So upon hearing of Hannibal's victory at Lake Trasimene, he prepares to enter on the side of Carthage. And his immediate goal is to secure access to the Adriatic by taking territories in Illyria and modern-day Albania, which then was Epirus. He builds 100 light vessels called lembi, which were mentioned in our discussion on the First Illyrian War, modeled after the Illyrian ships, hoping to use speed and surprise to maneuver his troops to avoid the heavier Roman quincremes. And so Philip deploys them in the Aegean, and they sail around the Aegean to Illyricum. But as he's doing that, he hears a rumor that the Romans are sending a fleet over, and he panics and sails back to Macedon. Turns out it was just a small scouting squadron that he could have easily avoided. And that was probably his best chance of invading Italy directly. And he blew it. Both Livy and Polybius say that this was a big mistake for Philip, and it lost him a lot of prestige amongst the Greeks and his allies. But again, this wasn't yet a formal alliance with Hannibal. After Hannibal's crushing victory at Cannae, then we find that he signs a formal treaty with Hannibal. Now, it's basically the idea being that, one or the other, if they sign a treaty with Rome, would not exclude the other. So if Hannibal were to make peace with Rome, he would include Macedon and ensure that Macedon and her allies would receive territories in Greece, Corcyra, Apollonia, Abydamus, Pharos, Dymal, Parthenia, and Atintania, and restore Demetrius of Pharos to Illyrium. But there's no, in the provisions that were given in the treaty that we see with Polybius and Livy, there's no provision that Philip would invade Italy directly. It seems, at least at that stage, that he had thought better of invading Italy and was more interested in consolidating control in Illyrium. And then at this time, the Romans capture the Macedonian ambassadors, and who have a copy of the treaty, and it falls into the hand of one Publius Valerius Flaccus, who's in southern Apulia. So at this point, Rome sends 25 warships to reinforce the already 25 ship strong fleet at Tarentum, for Flaccus to have a total of 50 quinqueremes in order to block any invasion attempt by Macedon by the Adriatic. And so at this point, the strategic vision here is that Rome is still way over its head fighting Hannibal, but it doesn't want Macedon to directly engage in the Italian front, which they have no guarantees that Macedon won't try to do that. So right now, Rome is ultimately playing for time in order to prevent them from crossing. 214 BC, Philip invades Illyria again. He sends a fleet of 120 lembi to support the attacks, and he captures Oricum and then marches up the river Auus to besiege Apollonia. At this point, the Romans send their fleet from Tarentum to Brundisium, and Flaccus is shadowing Philip's forces. And the Roman land forces, led by Marcus Valerius Laevinus, march to Oricium and take it back, and then march up the same river Aus to relieve the people that are besieged in Apollonia. Now, he sends 2,000 Roman soldiers at night via a circuitous route to secretly reinforce the city. And seeing how successful that was, he then launches a surprise night attack on Philip, who then flees in panic back to Macedon, leaving behind his catapults and ballistae, which are used as a means of defense for the city in the future. So at this point, twice Philip was forestalled by a very small Roman force from taking over Illyricum. So that's not really a good start to the war for Philip. And then in 213 and 212, Philip starts making advances into Illyria yet again. This time he's marching overland and not using his fleet. His left flank is anchored by the the Adriatic Sea as he's marching north into Illyricum, because it seems that he's finally learned the lesson that having naval supply lines without control of the sea isn't going to work, because the Romans are just going to cut you off. And he takes Antonina and Dymal. He brings to heel the tribes of the Dausaratae and Partheni and the Adrii. He also captures the city of Lissus. And at this point, there seems to be a concern that he might consider trying to invade Italy again, because he's consolidated control of Illyricum. And so at this point, we'll pause and reflect before we move on to Rome's broader intervention in the conflict. So what we see in this early stage of the First Macedonian War is the same realization that we had for the Second Punic War as a whole. Roman naval hegemony, which it had inherited from the First Punic War, was crucial to Rome's success. Control of the sea thwarted twice Philip's attempt to conquer Illyricum, and at least once thwarted his attempt to invade Italy directly. And the fact that Rome had control of the seas throughout this conflict, as well as the Second Punic War, guaranteed that Rome would not lose. It didn't necessarily guarantee Rome would win. It might be a stalemate, but it guaranteed Rome wouldn't lose. And Philip only made successes in Illyricum after he realized he had to do a land-only strategy and forfeit any sort of naval considerations completely. So what are your thoughts on the first stages of this conflict?
Yeah, I think that's a really good summary. It's important to recognize or just take note of the broader strategic situation of Rome at the time, because to put it bluntly, they have their hands completely full in dealing with Hannibal, who by now is in central Italy and crushed yet another Roman field army at Cannae. And so there's a lot of hysteria back at Rome about how to deal with Hannibal. And there's also this Macedonian expansion going on in the east that the Romans don't quite know how to deal with. One variable that makes all of this sort of Macedonian expansion in the east more interesting is that in Illyria, which is basically like modern day Albania, Montenegro, and parts of the coast that go up the eastern coast of the Adriatic Sea, there was all sorts of tribes at the time that were sort of vying for power over the last 2 centuries or so, and the tribe that came out on top are ultimately by this time were the RDA. And this is who ultimately developed sort of a friendship on paper with Rome, because the RDA were too decentralized to form these standing armies to do anything, to wage war against Rome effectively. And so what ends up happening is that before all of this business with Philip V happens, Rome sort of establishes a sort of semi-superficial alliance or friendship with the RDA, but they know that it's not this. I think they know it wasn't meant to last, but it was meant to sort of temporarily ease things so that the Romans wouldn't have to worry about some sort of potential amphibious landing coming from any of these kingdoms by the Adriatic or by Macedon. he mentioned in 214. By this time, you see sort of these attempts by Philip to go into deeper into RDA's territory, which was sort of garrisoned by Rome's general Lavinus that you mentioned, and I forget which port he landed at, or sort of the port city. It wasn't Apollonia; it was just south of that. But he was able to occupy these Apollonia and one other RDA and port, but Philip was basically free to raid other, Roman allied settlements along the coast. Lavinus didn't have enough men to go off and chase Philip's army into the mountains and get themselves into these situations when they are fighting, the Punic forces in central Italy. So this left Philip at least free to go after places like Epidamus, and he conquered even as far north as Lissus. And I think there actually were, according to Livy, there were attempts to go as far north as a place called Scodra, which is probably in modern day, with the map that I'm looking at here, at 211 BC. It's probably somewhere in Montenegro or northern Montenegro, something like that. Forgive me if there's a geography nerd that's listening to this, but that's about as far north as Philip had his eyes on. But he was really looking for a sort of a base of operations to send out his forces to invade Italy. But again, what you were suggesting earlier, and again, this is coming straight from Livy, is that he was a bit too tactically pensive. For example, with the construction of the 100 ships that he built in the Aegean, I think he was too fearful of heavy naval engagements, and he also demonstrated this too with his land forces. So again, just to kind of back up with this first initial stage, Philip is really looking for a way to, if not outright defeat Lavinus, at least contain his forces to these two ports and find a base of operations for him to send out forces to assist Hannibal in. Because again, Philip is trying to take advantage of this chaotic situation in central Italy, because Rome has its hands completely full with its toughest opponent it's ever come across. And so Philip is taking advantage of that, because I think Lavinus, at the peak of his, Lavinus's forces were something like 15,000. Could be wrong. It could be as high as 20,000, but I don't know that it was that much. I think it was like 200 ships and about 15,000 men. It just wasn't enough for him to go campaigning freely without securing the ports of Apollonia, and I think it was Epidamus, but I will find that name for you here shortly.
Right. So that's sort of the first phase of the war, in which case Rome is still not really in a position to do any sort of direct offensive operations. And arguably, due to the good fortune and lackluster performance of Philip, they didn't suffer worse for this. But beginning in 212 and 211, in part due to two relatively recent successes in the war, 212, the capture of Syracuse and consolidation of Sicily, in 211, the capture of Capua, which allows Rome to be in a position to A, deploy troops elsewhere, and B, in order to convince allies that, hey, this war is changing. You want to be on the winning side, i.e. Rome. And so while they're still not able to deploy forces directly in great numbers to fight Philip of Macedon, they use these victories in the war against Hannibal to inspire other Greek cities to ally with them. And they build a coalition of Elis, Sparta, Messina, the Aetolians. These are people we've already seen from the Cleomenian and Social War. So no surprise there. Not really hard to get them to switch sides. They also brought in Attalus of Pergamum. And then the Illyrian chiefs Plataris and Scrotaladius. So all of these guys are now a part of a Roman-led coalition against Philip and the Achaeans. And so using those victories as leverage over the Hannibal and Capua and the Sicilian Greeks in Syracuse, they use that as leverage to convince these people to end the treaty they had, which at that point was the Treaty of Naupactus of 217, to continue the war with Philip. Now, this is where we have active joint operations between the Romans and the Pergamum. So Labienus captures the island of Zacynthus, which is in the Adriatic. And with only the citadel of that city's island, the capital city of that island holding out. He also captures Oenadai and Acarnania, as well as the island of Naxos, which he hands over to the Aetolians. One of the things that the treaty stipulated was that Rome would get all the loot and booty from these battles, but their allies would get the territorial acquisitions. And that's something we'll see throughout the rest of this account. So Philip then hears the Romans are now operating in southern Greece. So Acarnania is basically along the Gulf of Corinth. To the far east is Delphi, and then to the far west is Delphi, and then further east is Acarnania, and so that's where Labienus is operating. So Philip seeks to consolidate his northern frontiers before he moves south. So he campaigns in Illyria and Thrace. He raids Oricum on Apollonia and captures Sintia, a Dardanian town on the frontiers of Macedon. And then he marches through Pelagonia, Lyncestis, and Bottia, and leaves a garrison at Tempe of 4,000 men. He then marches into Thrace to capture their capital city of Lamphorana. And so, having effectively secured the northern frontier, he hears word that the Acarnanians are asking for aid against an Aetolian invasion under the Strategos Scopus. And what they do is they send their women and children and elders to Epirus, and they swear an oath that, everybody, the fighting age men have to fight to the death to protect Acarnania, as well as, sending messages to Philip for aid. And when the Aetolians hear of both, they're like, yeah, this is a fight that we're not really interested in fighting. Because, even if the Aetolians were to have won, the cost of defeating such a determined foe could have easily led to 50% casualties, something that and then followed up by reinforcements from Macedon would have been disaster. So they just fell back. And then Philip wintered in Pella. Having secured a base, though, the island of Naxos, in the spring of 210 BC, Labienus, in conjunction with the Aetolians, captures Kerkyra, Phocian Antikyra, and the population of the latter city was transported to Rome as slaves. The city was handed over to the Aetolians. Philip is now sort of on the back foot at this point, seeing that all of these troops are organizing together. Then there's a combined Roman-Pergamon naval force, which basically completely locks down Philip's fleet. They don't really go out of port anymore. There's no real naval battles because both sides are deploying. On the Roman side, it's quinqueremes and quadriremes, and there's nothing the Macedonians have to match that. So they just stay in port. The Romans are able to get Elis, Messina, and Sparta to have a somewhat more active role in this conflict at this point. They're still sort of licking their wounds from the defeat in the Social War. Philip captures Echinus through a siege and repels a Roman landing force led by Publius Sulpicius Galba and the Aetolians led by Dormachus. So basically, Dormachus is the land general, and Sulpicius leads a naval marine force, which, as they were raiding along the coast, was scattered by Philip's forces. Aegina fell to a combined land sea attack by Sulpicius and Dormachus. The Aetolians sold Aegina to Attalus of Pergamum as a base of operations for 32 talents. And then in the spring of 209, Philip calls for aid from the Achaeans. But the Achaeans themselves are threatened by Elis, Sparta, and the Aetolians. And up until Philippomon takes command of the Strategoi ship, as we've seen in the previous conflicts, they don't do very well against Sparta and Messina. So they're sort of mobilizing for war. So it seems that so far, the Peloponnesus is still mobilizing for war because of they've been at war for like the last 20 years, going back to 228 with Cleomenes. Whereas Philip is a much larger state. The Romans and Pergamum are still fresh. So it's no surprise that they're more active in the earlier stages of this war. Attalus is elected as one of the strategoi of the Aetolian League to streamline command. So one of the things that we see here is that the Romans, the Aetolians, and the Pergamese are able to do what a lot of coalition armies don't do: have a unified strategic command. we don't really read of any serious disagreements between the decision-making of the Romans, the Aetolians, and the Pergames, and they seem to work together quite effectively as an organized body, which is in part why they were so successful at containing Philip's advances while the Achaeans were still recovering from how they were roughly handled in the Cleomenian and social wars. Now, this is important. Somewhere, I think it's in Thessaly or Boeotia, there were two battles at Lamia where Philip defeats an Achaean, Roman, and Pergamene force twice, and rather decisively, leading them to flee to the city of, defeating the general Piraeus, where the Aetolians then flee to the fortified city of Lamia. So this is interesting too. This is one of the few times where, admittedly, the Romans were a minority contingent and not in the commanding force, but as with the raiding party of Sulpicius, were defeated by the Macedonians. So as of 209 BC, Philip can boast that he's defeated the Romans in at least 3 engagements, which, again, these are small engagements and they're not majority Roman forces, but in the sort of propaganda war for the Greeks, that's enough. And we see in 209 as well that neutral parties of Egypt, Rhodes, Athens, and Chios seek to negotiate a settlement between Philip and the Aetolians. Philip marches to Phalara to help facilitate this negotiation. The representative of the Aetolians, Athemania, negotiates a 30-day truce. Philip marches his troops to Euboea, the island off the coast of Attica to the east, in order to blunt any landing or attack from Pergamum. And but the Romans, upon hearing the Romans are sailing a fleet to Naupactus and Attalus landing at Aegina, the Aetolians completely flip their position and demand that Macedon return Pylos to the Messeni, Antintinia to the Rome, and the Adrii to Plotaris and Scridalytus. Philip then claims that they use this as an excuse to start a war with him and to insult him, and continues military operations. And then Philip joins the Achaean forces near Dyme under the commander of the Achaeans, Slycliades, in order to attack Elis. But Elis is protected by Aetolian and Roman forces, so Sulpicius sends 4,000 Romans to this engagement, and in a largely inconclusive battle, blunts the Macedonian attack on Elis. There's a fierce battle that develops around Philip's person as he's knocked off his horse, with rumors that he's been killed. But he gets on another horse and eventually is able to withdraw from the fight. So technically, the Romans and Aetolians are successful in blocking the thrust of the Macedonian forces, but not successful in the sense of capturing and defeating Philip completely. And then the next day, Philip captures the fortified city of Pyrrhus. He's then forced to return to Macedon when he hears of an Illyrian invasion. And then Sulpicius joins forces with Attalus at Aegina for the winter. So that's what we might call the second phase of the war.
Yeah, I completely agree with that sort of timeline. The name of the port city that I was looking for is called Oricum, which was south of Apollonia. Those were the two sort of probably the most well-developed ports and coastal settlements that Epirus and that was not Epirus territory at the time. It was the RDA. So those were the two port cities that Lavinus, the Roman general, had occupied as a way of deterring Philip to send an invasion force into central Italy. From there, as you mentioned, by 211, I think it's important to sort of take a moment to just sort of assess the coalition that Rome had sort of successfully built against Macedon, and that is Illyria, the Aetolian League, Pergamon, Sparta, Elis, and Messenia. So, to Rome's credit, if they can't simply, field these massive armies of, tens of thousands of men and multiple legions campaigning freely in a certain territory as a campaign vision, they'll at least, they have, there's a great amount of skill by Roman statesmen and generals to form alliances and coalitions. And that's precisely what happened against Philip V, because the strategic situation is that the kingdom of Pergamon was in modern day Western Turkey, and that they had a lot of they had many naval assets at the time. They they also were allied with the Messenia and Elis, and many of these places, although they were small in territory, actually had enough naval assets to deter Philip from waging some type of prolonged naval campaign. You mentioned earlier that Philip sent all sorts of raiding parties to the north, or sorry, I should say he campaigned in the north to sort of secure its northern borders. And this was the case in Thrace, and he went as far north and east in a place called Perinthus, and he almost went as far north as a place called Scopai or Scupi. Yeah, you'll have to forgive me on the pronunciation of these places, but that is sort of on the northern frontier of Macedonia. And so Philip basically has to sort of secure what he can, because he can sort of see the writing on the wall that the Aetolians will be quickly reinforced by Lavinus and other Roman officers. For all he knows, there's more detachments on the way, because news for Philip, it was sometimes difficult for him to receive consistent updates on Hannibal's campaign in central Italy. So it was hard for him to know when to apply pressure on the Romans, just at the right time. And as you mentioned later on, there were two battles at a place called Lamia, where Philip did end up winning two battles, and basically it was a force of Macedonians against a force of Aetolians, backed up by some Roman forces and sort of what's been described as Pergamon auxiliaries, which is basically like logistics and I believe like archers and artillery, things like that. Although the information on Pergamon's contribution to that formation is fairly limited, but he is able basically to contain that coalition of Roman, Aetolian, and Pergamese forces to inside the walls of Lamia without them coming out, without leaving the city, effectively, sieging it, if only temporarily. So what you have happening here, just with all of those sort of details and very Greek and Roman names in mind, you've got a large coalition that's built up against Macedon on its western, southern, and eastern borders. Thrace and Dardania don't really present any sort of centralized, well-organized threat to Macedon. But what is developing in the western coast by the RDA is Lavinus's forces are going to begin marching south towards Macedon's ally, the Aetolians, the Achaeans, and Lavinus will send a force to attack several settlements, and they will campaign in the central Achaean territories, and this is by places like Naphactos, and Lavinus is able to go. He's able to march freely, basically all the way from Oricum and Apollonia, all the way through what is left of Epirus's territory, and all the way through the Aetolian territory, since they are allies, and then they are able to basically make this big march across uncontested into Achaean territory. And this is what is the Achaeans, for all of their sort of, I guess you could say, for their limited military capability, at least they were able to draw attention from the Aetolian League and Epirus to sort of, Macedon needed that alliance to keep pressure off of their southern borders. So now that Rome is reinforcing that with Lavinus's legions, that is what makes the situation by southern Macedon so precarious now for Philip, because places like Larissa and the that whole territory to the south basically is now up in question whether or not Philip can hold it.
Right. Now, the final stage of this war, in 208 BC, we have a combined Roman Pergamese fleet, 35 Pergamese ships, 25 Roman, sailing to take Lemnos. But they failed to take the city. Instead, they pillaged the island of Pepathra- Peparethos. Upon hearing that Sulpicius and Attalus were meeting at Heraclea Trachenia, the Council of the Achaeans, and neutral parties of Egypt and Rhodes, Philip sought to march on that area to capture the commanders and end the war. But he arrived too late to do that and withdrew because once they were fully mobilized against him, he was inferior in numbers. So he sets up watchtowers and fire beacons. Think of sort of like the fire beacons from Return of the King film, something like that, in order to get immediate notification of any landing or attacks into his territory. Upon leaving Heraclea, Sulpicius and Attalus sacked Aureus on the north coast of Eubea and Opus. Sulpicius took the loot, and Attalus stayed to plunder Opus. So, being warned of the division of the forces, Philip then tried to march on Attalus and destroy him, but Attalus was able to escape by sea. So, Attalus withdraws from the conflict because diplomatic pressure had been exerted on Prusias of Bithynia to ally with Philip and attack Pergamon. So, at that point, he withdraws from the war to defend his own kingdom, which is a big win for Philip. Now, Philip has a much freer hand, and the Roman naval forces are essentially cut in half, or more than half. And then we see that Philip, Sulpicius returns to Aegina, and basically he gets to the point where he tells the Romans, yeah, the war's pretty much over. We can recall almost all of our troops. And so the Romans, they're still active, and they still have a naval presence, but there's not much of a land presence at this point. So the main combatants of Pergamum and Rome have sort of withdrawn from the conflict. Pergamum because it's directly threatened, Rome in part because it claims to have achieved its objectives, but also because they're planning to invade Africa, and they need all the troops they can to take Carthage out once and for all. Philip then engages on a bit of a blitzkrieg. He takes Thronium, Tithronium, Drymeria, and Aureus. Peace negotiations with Egypt, Rhodes, Byzantium, Chios, Mytilene, and Athens mediating are assembled at Heraclea, but they break down. The Aetolians, with Roman consent, sue for peace. Then in 206, the Romans under Publius Sempronius Tudantius, with 35 ships and 11,000 troops, landed at Dyrrhachium, modern-day Albania, to incite the Partheni to revolt against Philip and lay siege to Damal. Philip arrives and drives out the Romans, and Sempronius broke off the siege and retreated to Apollonia. Sempronius fails to encourage the Aetolians to break their treaty with Philip. And by 205, the Treaty of Phoenicia is signed, whereby Rome is basically consolidating its forces for a final push on Africa, giving Philip a free hand. So what's interesting here is if we look at these three conflicts, the Cleomenian War, the Social War, and the First Macedonian War, what we see with the Macedonians is that, on the one hand, a lot of the martial prowess that we would expect from, say, Philip or Alexander is maintained. So Philip developed an army to march rapidly out of Macedon and perform quick, successful maneuvers, a sophisticated siege train to take cities by assault, and it seems that Philip still has that capability. The one thing that Philip can't seem to do is achieve lasting political successes, because he's ended up fighting over the same cities multiple times over the span of 20 years. The other thing that we see is that the Macedonians, historically weak in naval power, were contained largely effectively to the Greek peninsula by Rome, because Rome still commanded control of the sea. And so we see that, broadly speaking, on land, Macedon was successful, and broadly speaking, on sea, Rome and its allies were successful. And really, that's all Rome needed to do, because Rome needed to keep Macedon out of Italy in order to defeat Hannibal. So, arguably, in the strategic sense, the First Macedonian War is a success for Rome, because Rome is able, with minimal effort, to keep a fairly powerful enemy at bay while it's busy with Hannibal. But by the same token, though, Philip is able to maintain the status quo with some minor gains in Illyricum and Thrace at the expense of the Romans. So overall, the First Macedonian War is largely inconclusive.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a great sort of summary. Yeah, and again, by the time you could say even by the beginning of the First Macedonian War by 215, the political situation of Greece more broadly was still, I mean, obviously, Macedon could not centralize all of these various city-states into some sort of anti-Roman coalition. There was just too much history there, too much. There was just too much hostility that had taken place beforehand. So there was never really any chance that there could have been this Macedonian consolidation of broader Greek mainland against Rome. Sometimes you hear that, sort of speculated, in works concerning the Macedonian Wars, but I think that is sort of the reality of things. I think one interesting development in the war before the treaty between Lavinus and Philip is, of course, the Pergamese defeat at Opus, and that's with the Pergamese general Attalus. Now, he's, as you mentioned earlier, in sort of the Lord of the Rings-esque sort of fire signal, Philip was able to navigate to Opus and caught Attalus by surprise, and Attalus was able to barely escape with some of his ships. And Philip considered the escape of Attalus, something that this like sort of a failure of his, that he could have crushed the Pergamese harder, but effectively with the defeat at Opus, that basically took Pergamon out of the war, or at least removed them from being any sort of existential threat towards the Macedonians. However, the situation to the west meaning west of Macedon's controlled territory in the RDA's sort of port cities, precisely where Philip and Lavinus had fought, that the Macedonians couldn't form, they just couldn't simply field these large enough forces to drive out the Romans, keep the Aetolian League at bay, and then also, with another, and also keep all of these other sort of naval powers sort of at bay as well. And that includes Messenia, Elis, Sparta. At least they did remove Pergamon as one of those threats from the Roman coalition. But yeah, you're absolutely right. In the sense, it was good for Rome because it guaranteed, at least for a time, that there would be no sort of invasions coming from the Greek mainland into Italy. And also it allowed for Macedonia to, if anything, it was a bit of a ceasefire to solidify their territory against Epirus, the Aetolians, and maintain their alliance with the Achaeans. And then basically the smaller belligerents of Rome's, of Rome's coalition, that being Elis, Messenia, and Sparta, they were basically too small to do much of anything against the Achaeans, since the Achaeans are who bordered Messenia, Sparta, and Elis. But they still remained pro-Roman in their sort of their political orientation. So that would prove to be a problem later on for the Macedonians as well as the Achaeans. But yeah, effectively you have the Pergamese that were removed due to the battles at Opus, and Philip was able to sort of keep what he had secured during that time, but could not drive the Romans out, and the Romans also guaranteed that there would be no base of operations for the Macedonians to send invasion to Italy.
Yes. Now, what we'll end with is the one battle in this conflict that is fairly well attested to in both Plutarch and Polybius, the Battle of Mantinea in 207 BC between Philopoemen and the Spartan tyrant Machanidas. So we've been hinting at this for a little bit already, but in 209, 208, Philopoemen engages in a series of military reforms, which converts the Achaean foot into something from a traditional hoplite formation, say something like what we might have expected at Thermopylae, to a Macedonian formation that we would have expected, like what Philip was using, and reformed the cavalry into engaging in shock combat and effective maneuvers, likely inspired by the Thessalians and Macedonians. So now with this new reformed Achaean army, which probably looks a lot like Antigonus Dosson's army at Salacia, just a bit smaller, we see that Philopoemen is raising forces to engage Machanidas. Now, Machanidas is operating out of Tegea and decides to march to Mantinea to engage and defeat the Achaeans. So, according to the ancient sources, Machanidas is marching in two columns, mercenaries and Spartans, and parallel to each other, with supply carts in the rear with catapults and darts for them to fire as a sort of like preliminary field artillery barrage to break up the Achaean forces. Philopoemen takes up a defensive position between, let's see here, a hill that overlooks the Xenus Road and the mountains bordering Elisaphacy. And between these two, the hill and the mountains, there's a large trench that's been dug. And the reason why Philopoemen takes this position is he believes that either A, the Spartans in attempting to cross this ditch will leave themselves vulnerable and be repelled, probably in light of the siege of Sparta in 272 when Pyrrhus tries to cross the ditch and is repelled by the Spartan defenders, or they'll avoid it entirely, which then gives Philopoemen time to plan for future operations against the Spartans. Now, the position that he takes, he puts the light troops on the hill overlooking the Xenus Road, and then as you go east, you then have his phalanxes, you have his phalanx, and then then you have the Illyrians and the mercenaries, and then in the middle you have the phalanx, and on the far right you have his cavalry. Machanidas marches up his forces and begins deploying his catapults. And Philopoemen, seeing this on his left wing, sends his Tarentine light cavalry and light infantry to attack and disrupt Machanidas' catapults. Machanidas sends in his mercenaries, and in a brief little commentary, Polybius says, well, mercenaries of tyrants fight harder because they know if they win the battle, the tyrant will have more enemies and hence need to hire more mercenaries, hence job security. Whereas mercenaries who fight for a democratic polis, like the Achaeans, when the battle's over, they'll be dismissed. So they don't have the job security and the prospect of future pay and loot. So he argues that disparity led to the Spartans overcoming the Achaean mercenaries. Now, on this account, then, Machanidas then routs not only the mercenaries, but he leads an attack that routs the Illyrians and what Polybius, in a sort of general vague sense, calls heavy troops. I'm not sure what he means by that. Heavily armored troops, but generally phalangites are not heavily armored unless they're in the front rank of the force. So it's a little vague there. And there is some vagaries in this account that don't quite match up with Plutarch. We'll get to that in a moment. And so then, instead of following the original plan about flanking Philopoemen's forces and then pinning the center so that they would not move while the Spartans outflanked them, Machanidas decides to just throw in all of his eggs in one basket and chase the fleeing mercenaries to Mantinea itself, crossing the dike in the process. Some of these mercenaries reform outside the gates of Mantinea, and then, according to Polybius, Philopoemen then reforms his forces and attacks the Spartans exposed in the flank. And now they're on the opposite side of the trench, between the trench and the city of Mantinea. And then in an attempt to flee, many are killed in the crossing or trample themselves. And then as Machanidas is trying to flee, he's then killed in personal combat by Philopoemen. Now, Plutarch doesn't go into as much detail, and he seems to place more of an aggressive position on the fact of the Achaeans, that as soon as Sparta pursues the mercenaries, rather than the initiative going to Sparta, the Achaeans take advantage of that and then rout them. So there is some debate there. And the early 20th century historian Delbruck argues, why would Philopoemen even send his cavalry across the ditch in the first place, how would they even cross it? And if they could cross it, how would the ditch be sufficient to block the Spartans? So there is some discussion over which accounts are the most accurate, and does Polybius have holes in it? But what we can say is that, as in light of the Cleomenian War, we see that the Persian wars between Greece and Persia, or even Alexander and Persia, field fortifications are not really a part of the situation. But by the time of Cleomenes and Philopoemen and Machanidas, we're beginning to see that, yeah, this is quite common now. So it seems that the Roman penchant for trenches and fortified positions, even in a tactical situation, is becoming normative even for the Greeks. So we're seeing that as the Romans and Carthaginians are fighting and accelerating the military technology race and new tactics and new strategies, the Greeks are able to do so as well. And it's interesting to see that Sparta's able to do this, because one of the reasons why they lost to Thebes is they were unable to adapt to the new technology of the new tactics of attacks in echelon, the deeper right flank, and combined arms with cavalry and light forces. So these new Spartan leaders do seem to have learned their lesson and are able to adapt to the new situations, but Sparta has fallen so far behind that it's ultimately outgunned. And after the death of Machanidas, the Achaean forces are in pursuit of the Spartans, having slain 4,000 of them, take Tegea by storm, and pillage the countryside around Sparta, ending Sparta's involvement in this war. The important thing here is, for the first time, the Achaeans are able to defeat their neighbors without the aid of Macedon. Both in the Cleomenian and social wars, they had to wait for Macedon to show up to start winning battles. Now they can win battles on their own steam without having to call on Macedon for support, which is the beginning of the ascendancy of the Achaeans, which would culminate in the annexation and incorporation of Sparta and the complete unification of the Peloponnesus. And all of this is the result of the reforms and leadership of Philopoemen.
I think that's a great summary on Philopoemen. Yeah, these sort of reforms were brought in just sort of the right time for the Achaeans, and yeah, of course, the sort of the big event for Philopoemen is this this sort of single-handed defeat of the Spartans. Now, I think it's, for many sort of reasons, Sparta is viewed as this sort of unconquerable, elite sort of shock force amongst the broader Greek city-states throughout this, just throughout this era of the Punic Wars, and even as far back as the Peloponnesian War. However, you can see that Sparta, just in sort of its, for many reasons, sort of its cultural rigidity, and also its, I think part of its sort of just its own, I guess you could say, even for the time, arguably backward sociology. I mean, they just weren't willing to adapt to new situations, whereas at least the Macedonians, the Athenians, and many other different kingdoms and city-states throughout mainland Greece and even in the Peloponnesus, they were willing to do that, whereas Sparta just sort of continued to dwindle in its projection of power as well as its cultural influence throughout Greece, and it was just basically too stubborn for its own good. And this translated both in terms of its own sort of self-defeating demographic, sort of Spartan eugenics, and also, this rigidity also translated onto the battlefield, which you just explained really well with sort of the introduction of Philopoemen and these sort of Achaean reforms that helped defeat Sparta. But Sparta just wasn't willing to adapt, or simply could not adapt. And what you had mentioned earlier, too, with this sort of clash between Rome and Punic forces, is that in a very similar way to World War II, both sides, it forced tactical and some technological innovation insofar as the use of field artillery and siege weaponry, and also the slow introduction and gradual use of frontier fortresses that Rome would later popularize with Caesar in Gaul and places like that, where both the Macedonians and the Romans would start doing this. I think, as you've argued, and I think it's true to say that, the Romans probably, I think the Romans popularized the use of these frontier fortresses, but it's difficult to say where they originally came from. But I think that I think that the Macedonians and the Romans sort of kind of came to, they came to understand the importance of using these sort of temporary frontier fortresses while they're out campaigning, because that will at least that decreases the vulnerability of armies in general, and it can extend the life of a campaign quite a bit. And this is something that at least according to what I read from Polybius, is that's what helped Philopoemen be so successful against his enemies to the south. So yeah,
exactly. So I think this is a brief summary. The key takeaways of the First Macedonian War is that Rome's ultimate success was ensured by control of the sea, just as it was in the broader Second Punic War. We see that the Romans were able to construct a viable alliance of Greek city-states that worked together fairly flawlessly as far as broader strategic organization, and was largely successful in containing Philip. We see that Philip was very poor at utilizing naval assets, was often very headstrong, but on land was generally successful with his sieges and battles. And we also see that with the rise of Philopoemen and the Achaeans at the Battle of Mantinea, the rise of the Achaeans as a dominant force in the Peloponnesus that wouldn't need to always rely on Macedon for support, which was then the precondition for its unification of the Peloponnesus itself. And I think those are the big takeaways. Thoughts on that?
I think that's a perfect sort of summary of the conflict in general. Yeah, it just basically guaranteed that Rome got what it wanted out of it, because it basically guaranteed itself that there would be no sort of broader Macedonian invasion of the Italian mainland, and that left Rome free to devote the majority of its forces towards getting rid of Hannibal. And also, Philip got a bit what he wanted out of it as well, in the sense that it temporarily consolidated his territories against this broader coalition that was quickly built by Rome. So it bought Philip some time, and it also bought the Romans time. But yeah, neither Rome nor Macedon could throw. Well, Rome just simply couldn't send just legion after legion into Greece just due to war with Hannibal. But yeah, I think your summary's dead on.
All right. Well, thank you, Terminal Philosophy. It's always a pleasure.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
It's Todd Lewis of the Prayers of Folly podcast signing off.